Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about history. I would also like to talk to you about revolution. We live in a world where it has become, for want of a better term, a trend to tear down old monuments to historical figures. In the United States especially, focusing on people such as Confederate generals or other noted Confederates, or any memorial to the Confederate States of America from the American Civil War. But it's not just the Confederates, it's slaveholders in general, or people who are seen to have promoted ideas of race or oppression of any kind, be it racial oppression or class oppression or what have you. Historical figures who are now being vilified, and we are told that we cannot revere them without perpetuating the evils that they, at least supposedly, conducted. In London, for example, they've torn down several statues, and the Mayor of London seems to be endorsing this action. So does the entire city government. And they are now thinking of renaming streets to get rid of Britain's imperial past. Many people have commented on this topic before. I'm nothing new. But I would like to give my views on it. I do have a unique take on it. But I do agree with the sentiment that is also being promoted against these actions. That they are tearing down history. And that by removing these monuments, you don't actually eliminate racism or bigotry or oppression. You simply erase the past. I find it a great shame to do so. I don't really approve of destroying Confederate monuments. Not because I'm a racist, but because I value history, and I know there's more to the Confederate States of America and the American Civil War than just white supremacism and racism. I also know that racial politics of the 19th century weren't really based on the same assumptions that we do today. For example, I've heard numerous people say the Constitution of the Confederate States in America specifically enshrines white supremacism in law. And what they're actually saying isn't just that it has the general concept of white supremacism. They're saying it literally says that there should be a doctrine of white supremacism in the nation. And that isn't actually true if you read the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy never actually used the term white supremacy or white supremacist in the Constitution that they were under. But what's more, a lot of people seem to project modern attitudes onto the past quite often. It's a topic I've discussed before, and it's something that I address rather often. For instance, I've done a good many videos on militant atheists, not because I want to turn this into a Christian apologetics channel, but because they're very frequent on the internet and are a very big purveyor of misinformation, despite being the champions of reason, but they're not the only ones. I also intended a couple of years ago to do a series on David Barton and wall builders, and I still intend to get to that sometime. But in both cases, you have people who are using history to give themselves an identity, but also to justify modern political and social ideas, as well as to reinforce a certain outlook or philosophy. As such, the historical narrative has to be crafted to fit this narrative. Sometimes that just means presenting it in a certain way, but not necessarily misrepresenting it. But all too often we do misrepresent history in order to fit it into our narrative, in order to justify contemporary concerns. And the Confederate States of America is a good example of that, because many people see them as identical to the Nazis, the National Socialists, that the Confederates had essentially the same beliefs as Adolf Hitler. This is, of course, demonstrably false. But we tend to envision what we call the Confederate flag. Really, it was the Confederate battle flag, and specifically the battle flag of Northern Virginia. But for the sake of argument, I'll say the Confederate flag, with the swastika flag that was flown by National Socialist Germany. And indeed, there are white supremacist groups that fly both of those flags. The modern Ku Klux Klan flies both of them, for example. But many people point to modern white supremacist groups flying both flags to prove that this is what people in the 19th century were actually thinking like. And as such, I've heard people discussing the Confederacy in terms that don't make any sense from a historical perspective. For instance, I've actually heard people mention that it wasn't just blacks that suffered under the Confederacy, but Latinos and Native Americans, and of course Jews, because the white supremacists who ran the Confederate States hated any racial minority that was not white. So naturally, they would have accepted the anti-Semitic ideas that Hitler would have as well. They would have hated and distrusted the Jews. This idea is easy to refute, because the Secretary of State within the Confederate States of America was himself Jewish. His name was Judah Benjamin. And you can look him up. Look up Judah Benjamin. He was definitely Jewish, and he was definitely the Secretary of State of the Confederate States of America. Indeed, many Jewish families supported the Confederacy, and Confederate law viewed Jews as white. Furthermore, many Jewish families actually participated in the slave trade, both by owning slaves and by selling them. Many of them were, in fact, the major slave sellers. I'm not saying this to be anti-Semitic or to blame all of our problems on the Jews. That is far from what I'm saying. In fact, you could also find Jews in the 19th century that were abolitionists, like Isaac Leeser, who also gave us the first English version of Tanakh, or the Jewish Bible. There were many Jews, especially in the North, who actively fought against the slave trade as understood at the time, and against slavery, and believed in emancipation. Indeed, even during the actual Civil War itself, many Jews supported the Union cause, and there were even Jewish soldiers fighting in the Union Army. However, that doesn't prove the Jews in general supported the abolition of slavery, or the Jews in general supported the Union and not the Confederacy. Just as the Jews who did support the Confederacy or who did participate in the slave trade doesn't prove the Jews supported slavery or the Jews supported the Confederacy. Rather, history is more diverse than that. There were Jews on both sides of the issue during the Civil War. But that brings me back to my point. The Confederate States of America did not view Jews the same way Nazi Germany viewed Jews. And that is ultimately a point that most people seem unable to understand. They don't seem to be able to grasp a concept of racial theory that isn't the one being promoted today. As a result, even actual Nazi Germany is very different than how people often imagine it. The racial theories of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists was actually more complex and nuanced than people give it credit for, and it wasn't just a blanket white supremacist view. That's not to say that it was good, but simply to make a point about how history unfolds. Another good example of this that isn't related to the current issues of the day would be the First Amendment of the United States. I'm bringing this up to be somewhat more neutral, but it does tie into the events of today, considering that some people want hate speech laws or regulation. However, I'm bringing this up because it is also somewhat outside of the debate. Everyone knows that America's founding fathers believed in free speech. As such, they enshrined it in law in the First Amendment. They also believed that the government should be secular, which is why they separated church from state, and they believed that the press should be free to print what it wants. The First Amendment protects these rights, preventing any government within the United States or any government agency from censoring the free press, or from blocking assembly, or from speaking out their views and opinions. That it is illegal to halt these things, just as it is illegal to institute a church under government authority, and it is illegal to hinder religious expression within those churches. But what most people don't seem to know is that in reality, when the First Amendment was passed, America's founding fathers did not intend it to be universal. Think about the first part of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. This is an interesting point that most people overlook. For you see, the way we understand the First Amendment, no government within America, no state government, no county government, no city government may infringe upon the right to free speech or religious liberty. We take the First Amendment to be binding on any legal authority within the United States, and we project that view back upon America's founding fathers. In reality, the First Amendment was applicable only to Congress and the federal government. During the late 18th and early 19th century, the states were allowed to have state churches, and some did. The last one to get rid of them was Massachusetts, which I believe got rid of it in 1833. But the states were allowed to have state churches within their borders. And the abolition of state churches within the states had nothing to do with the law or the First Amendment, but rather the states following a Jeffersonian principle on their own and voting within their own assemblies to disestablish their churches if they had any. Rhode Island never had a state church, for instance. It was founded by a Baptist specifically for religious freedom and to be a haven, so there was no specific instituted church, but that's another matter. The First Amendment also did not protect your right to free speech or to a free press. There were cases in America, for instance, where a state law prevented you from publishing certain things, and censorship was heavy. It's just that the federal government didn't institute this censorship, the state government did, and sometimes the county or city government did, or if you were in Louisiana, the parish government. And the federal government was well aware of this censorship and did nothing, because the First Amendment applied only to the federal government and to Congress and not to the states. The states could implement laws that hindered your free speech. The states could institute laws that censored what you said or that hindered a free press. This only changed technically in law after the American Civil War. The same Civil War whose statues to Confederate soldiers are being torn down now and targeted for the cause of our problems. With the passage of the 14th Amendment, it was understood that federal law superseded state law and was binding upon state law. That means that the First Amendment was now applicable at the state level and not merely at the federal level. Even then, though, it took a while to implement this. The 14th Amendment was not created specifically to spread First Amendment rights to the rest of Americans. It was designed to curtail the issues that had been brought up during the American Civil War, such as explicitly denying that states have a right to secede from the Union, and granting the federal government authority to prosecute people who had actively decided to leave the Union. And, of course, to free the slaves. The 14th Amendment was not created with spreading the First Amendment in mind, or even with generally spreading the Bill of Rights and its concepts to others. That was simply a consequence of how it was worded. And many states continued with their censorship laws, or even added new ones. It wasn't until the 20th century, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I usually can, but I'm a bit tired when I'm making this video. I think it was the 1920s or 1930s that someone sued the state government that he was in, which I believe was New York, over censorship laws using the First Amendment, and actually won. It isn't the first time someone used the First Amendment to sue a state government, though. Prior to the American Civil War, 2 or 3 cases were brought before federal courts that did that. But in each case, the federal government either dismissed the case for lack of grounds or sided with the state over the individual. In this case, it wasn't just the First Amendment, though, but also the 14th. And under the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment is indeed applicable to the state governments. So the state could not hinder his publications. The way we understand the First Amendment of the United States is that it was intended to protect our rights to free speech, free press, and freedom of religion. And we project that understanding onto the past, assuming that this was the intention of the First Amendment all along. But it simply wasn't. Just like those who point to the Second Amendment and argue that it was originally intended for private gun ownership are actually mistaken. And I'm not saying this because I favor gun control. I'm rather neutral on the issue of whether people should have a right to own a gun or not. I don't really want to turn this video into why people shouldn't be allowed to have guns. Personally, I think that under certain circumstances or in certain locations, private gun ownership should be okay, but I can understand the arguments for gun control as well. It's a complex issue, but I'm not discussing it. All I'm discussing is the intention of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was not written to actually give individuals a right to own guns. The Second Amendment says that Congress will not impede the people's right to keep and bear arms. But every other time when the word "the people" are used in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights was largely the product of the same people who gave us the Constitution, even though it came later, the people never refers to an individual right. It refers to a collective right. And what Congress was trying to protect was the rights of state militias, or even of local militias. The problem with this is, just because the people have a right to keep and bear arms, that doesn't mean I have a right to keep or bear arms, or you have a right to keep or bear arms. It could very well be that a state would pass a law that says private gun ownership is illegal. This would have been very unlikely in the late 18th or early 19th century, since guns were often seen as necessary for protection of your land, because if you had a farm, you might have wolves or other animals threaten your livestock. You may also have certain animals that would threaten your vegetation. You may also need to go hunting just to get meat. People hunted deer and rabbit and other things. Private gun ownership was never really in question during this time period, even in Britain, which today we think of as not allowing people to own guns, didn't really have any restriction on firearms back then. But the question isn't whether it was likely for states to pass laws that forbid private gun ownership. The question isn't even whether we should allow private gun ownership. The question is, why does the Second Amendment exist? And after having looked into it, I have come to the same conclusion that most historians have, and bow to the consensus that it was more about protecting the communal rights to protect guns for an established community. That a community should have the right to have a militia for its own protection, or that a county or even a city could have these rights, and especially a state. A state should have a militia. The people need to be kept armed to defend themselves. But that's not an individual right to own a gun, no matter how we interpret it today. And I'm not arguing, again, that we shouldn't interpret it that way, just like I'm not arguing that we shouldn't interpret the First Amendment the way it is. To be perfectly honest, I'm a big fan of free speech. I'm a big fan of free press. I'm a big fan of freedom of religion. But we're not talking about what I'm a fan of. We're not talking about what I want or like or agree with. We're talking about history. Or at least I am. The protesters are not talking about history. The protesters are talking about mythology. By that, I don't mean they're talking about a made-up story that's not true. That's a very casual definition of mythology these days. I'm rather talking about a story that transcends its historical reality and embodies higher principles. That's actually what a myth is. Many militant atheists, for example, like to talk about Christian mythology. They do this to demean Christianity by reducing it to the level of Greek or Norse mythology, by saying it was made-up stories people used to believe a long time ago, but they're not true. They're myths. They wish to equivocate it, all because they want to tear down Christianity. And I oppose the use of the term Christian mythology precisely because it is bigoted and hateful coming from them. But in a very real sense of the term, the Christian story is mythology, because a myth can be entirely true, which is something most people don't seem to realize. You can have a story that has become mythical, that is nevertheless entirely true. It isn't mythical because it's not true. It isn't even mythical because we don't know if it's true or not. It is mythical because that story is more than just a story about things that happened. It's not even just a story that we can use to illustrate certain points. It is a story that embodies those principles, that brings life to abstract concepts, that defines how we understand reality. To that extent, it is true that the life of Jesus, including his death on the cross and his resurrection for the forgiveness of sins, is a myth. It is a myth because to a Christian, this story is not just something that actually happened historically, but it transcends that, representing God's love for us, representing our own brokenness and fallenness and how we can be redeemed from that. And the same can be said of other religious figures, such as Muhammad and his life. Largely a myth, in the sense that, to a Muslim, Muhammad is this perfect example, and these exploits and the things he taught are given life through knowing his history. Muhammad was a real person. He really did these things. But to Muslims, it's more than that. I have often said everyone is religious, including atheists. When I say this, people hear me saying atheism is a religion. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is religion is an innate aspect of the human condition. It is how we understand who we are as individuals and who we are as groups. It is how we understand the world we live in. And the idea that we can replace religion with science and that science is better doesn't really work, because all you're really doing is making science into a religion. And at the end of the day, you start making science into something that's not science because you have to start introducing philosophical concepts, moral concepts, judgments. But the reason I'm saying this here is because what we are seeing in our world today is very much a religious struggle. It isn't a religious struggle that focuses on one formal organized religion, though. People in various religions are supporting the protesters, just as people in various religions are opposing them. Indeed, you can have one person who is, for example, Catholic, support the protesters, while another Catholic belonging to the same religion opposes them. But this is because, while formally they belong to the same religion, they are both Catholic and members of the Catholic Church, they don't have exactly the same religion, because there's other things in addition to Catholicism informing their perspective. And that's what we're really talking about. I know I just said a myth can be a true story. But just because a myth can be true doesn't mean a myth is true. A myth can be an entirely invented story. In fact, a myth can be a story that people know is invented, that they know isn't true. The important aspect of a myth is a true story in essence. A myth is a true story because it represents an ideal. Whether the events described in the actual story are true or not, the myth embodies abstract principles to which we believe in. So to that end, all myths are true stories, even if the actual story being told is not true. And that's important to know here, because what we are watching unfold are people motivated by a mythology. And I, again, mean that in the academic sense. They are looking at a history. And a lot of what they're saying about history broadly happened. but it didn't happen in the way they think it did. And as a result, they are projecting back onto the past modern values in order to use historical villains as stand-ins for modern villains. To look at a historical struggle and to make it a modern struggle. The American Civil War happened, and the Confederate States of America existed. But the Confederate States of America were not modern alt-righters. The Confederate States of America was not a National Socialist country. The Confederate States of America was not these things. And yet we think it was. We project what we need them to be onto them so that they can embody abstract principles and be used to justify modern social action. Tearing down statues is in effect an attempt to embody those principles through these historical figures and translate that in some tangible way into the real world. We cannot kill a Confederate general, for they are long dead already, but we can destroy their statues and symbolically kill them. But we are not killing the man. We are killing what the man represents to us. And even then, we're not really killing it because it is an abstract concept. We're just destroying an avatar. At least that's what we are doing if we are part of the protesters. To others, these symbols mean something very different. It is this conflict of understanding that has led to the debate. The people who view these monuments as products of our history and as part of our heritage to be preserved, not because you necessarily agree with everything these men did, but because they did them and it shaped who we are now, are at odds with those who view those statues as the living embodiments of those long dead men, and as something they can destroy to send a message that those attitudes shall not be accepted. Attitudes that are quite often not really the true attitudes that people have in mind. Attitudes that these historical figures often did not hold. But what really scares me is that this is how revolutions start. Even the just revolution of the American Revolution, where the founding fathers, truly moral men, honest and filled with integrity, looked at the tyranny of King George III and saw the oppression and said, "No more." A revolution fully justified by the evils they opposed began by riots and protests and tearing down statues. Conservatives, or even liberals who don't necessarily agree with the protesters, honor America's founding fathers. They look upon them as heroes and say what they did was good and just. But how does it differ from these protesters? If it's just talking about pulling down statues and destroying monuments, well, America's founding generation did the same. We just don't like thinking of it that way, and we will make our excuses about how just their cause was. And they are excuses. The truth is, the American Revolution was not the act of defiance against a tyrant, we are told it was. King George III wasn't a tyrant, and he certainly wasn't an absolute monarch. The American colonists were not living through a hell on earth. And America's founders were not these brave and moral souls filled with integrity, fighting purely for the liberty of all. They fought for their own agendas and their own interests. People who are critical of the protesters claim that the protests are really a smokescreen, and that the real reason these protests are happening is because other, more shadowy and powerful people are manipulating the situation in order to gain what they want. Yet these same people making that criticism about this protest will point to America's founding fathers as the examples we should follow. The people who are manipulating the protests today are, of course, evil and to be resisted. But America's founders, well, they were just and good and should be supported. But they were no different, really. They had their own agendas, they had their own desires. I'm not saying this because I side with protesters, quite the contrary. I wish to preserve our history and think the destruction of these monuments does nothing but cause ignorance. But this is what revolution is all about. Revolution is about destroying the past to build a new future. The American Revolution destroyed the British history and heritage Americans had, and is so thorough that today Americans will even refer to the American Revolution as the Americans against the British. And we believe that America's history began with the Pilgrims, and really didn't get started until the Revolution. America is purely defined by the new values that America's founders instituted. And America's founders were the ones leading their protests. And they destroyed statues, and they destroyed monuments. They burned down houses, they looted, they rioted. Yet, they were justified in what they did. They were righteously angry at this tyrannical king. Their cause was just. So when they break into someone's store and steal from him, or when they burn down someone's house, they were justified. But not the modern protesters. They're rioting, they're looting. The truth is, the conservatives have their own myth. And that myth is that the American Revolution was this civilized war, in which army went against army, but at least on the American side, the Americans never rioted, the Americans never looted, the Americans only attacked military targets, the Americans respected civilians. None of that's true. The American Revolution got started with angry mobs pulling down statues and burning down houses and rioting and looting. And after the American Revolution was won, the ideals and narrative of the victors became our accepted truth. Should these protests lead to a revolution, the same will happen. They will be heroes, and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will hear about their just cause. And 100, 200 years later, we will be saying they lived under tyranny and oppression and imagining how awful it was. And truth will no longer matter. Just as truth doesn't matter that not all Confederate generals were particularly abusive to their slaves. Not all of them even had slaves. And one of the most racist and hateful of the Confederate generals, one of the most condemned today, Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, argued that blacks should be allowed to sit for the Tennessee State Bar and to be accepted as lawyers. Real history is much more complex than our simple political narratives. People are much more complex than our simple political narratives. And there's often more perspectives than just the 2 or 3 our narratives fill in. And yet, here we are, witnessing the birth of another revolution, with today's conservatives who oppose it, thinking they would stand as revolutionaries in the 18th century alongside George Washington when they would have been the Tories of that era. Destroying monuments does nothing but conceal the past. People may imagine that the statues embody the spirit of the long dead men, and imagine that those men represent something they hate and despise and wish to purge. But in the real world, people did not look at the statues of Confederate generals or the Confederate monuments that were scattered around America and wish to breed white supremacism. Most just saw them as statues and kept walking by. Others saw them as an integral part of American history. But few actually viewed them as symbols of white supremacism, and fewer still rallied behind them as such. The destruction of monuments, the looting, the rioting, the violence, it may get you what you want, but the revolutionary spirit is never stilled, and those who fight revolutions are those driven by a hatred in their heart. But it is a hatred that will not be quenched simply by destroying statues or even by killing men or giving the government you want. Hatred can easily become an addiction, especially when it becomes an identity. And you will need more things to hate, more things to be angry at, more things to feel victimize you. For this is your identity, and this is your purpose. And this is also your power, for it is that anger that drove you to where you are now. It is that hatred that drove you to where you are now. It is that violence that got you what you wanted. So why not continue to use it against political rivals that come up after the fact? All revolutions are evil, and all revolutionaries are evil. Even America's founding fathers were evil men, driven by hatred and passions and lusts, bringing about violence, all for personal gain. And in the end, the tumult they caused wasn't worth it. And I would say the same of the modern protesters. A life of violence is not a life of peace, and one does not gain peace with hatred in one's heart, and one does not gain peace or love by fostering an identity of hatred, just as one does not gain a sense of self-respect by fostering an identity based around victimization and oppression. In fact, it becomes an easy way of justifying your own failures by saying, I would have succeeded, but I am oppressed. And in the end, that kind of attitude means that you will often be lazy and not even try. Not really. You'll want it handed to you to compensate for your oppression. And you will still not be happy, even if it's handed to you. Because you can't be happy. You can't be at peace. You can't be at rest. You must always have someone who hates you, who oppresses you, and whom you must fight against. For that is the source of your power. I don't have much else to say, so I'll sign off. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.